So officially welcome to part 4 of S is for serious or scintillating or something Unitarians. And science and technology is the topic. And we're starting with Thomas Southwood Smith. Southwood to his friends. He was born in Somerset, that's in England, south of Wales. He was sent to Bristol's Baptist Academy at age 14. But after meeting and admiring some Unitarians, he left the Baptist faith and broke with his family. He married at age 20, but his wife died after 4 years, as would happen to people in the 18th century, and he became the single parent of 2 daughters. He then studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where he was the popular lay leader of a Unitarian congregation. He and James Yates founded the Scottish Unitarian Association, which, as you see here, is still going strong. Southwood also preached and published lectures in support of universalism. In 1816, back home in Somerset, he was both a doctor and a minister. In 1820, he remarried and moved to London. 4 years later, he was a physician at the London Fever Hospital, one of several voluntary hospitals in London. Voluntary hospitals gave free health care and were supported by charitable donations. And I only learned about them myself through Southwood. London also had private for-profit hospitals, but it wouldn't get any municipal hospitals run by the government until 1867. The London Fever Hospital quarantined and treated people with infectious diseases, and Southwood began writing papers on public health. It was the early 19th century, so much of what he wrote was just wrong. He supported the miasma theory that rotting matter creates bad air that causes diseases. Well, luckily, cleaning up rotting garbage reduced the real culprit, germs. He showed the connection between living conditions and disease, and he was strongly supported by Charles Dickens. As a utilitarian, Southwood argued for legalizing the use of dead bodies in medical schools. In fact, he caused a sensation by publicly dissecting the father of modern utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, after he was dead, of course. The body was mummified and, by Bentham's request, put on public display at the University College London with a wax head. His real head used to rest between his feet, but after one student pranked too many, it's now under lock and key. Southwood's dissection stunt helped to pass the 1832 Anatomy Act, which allowed medical students to dissect unclaimed cadavers. This put an end to grave robbing and led to improvements in surgery. Our next guy is a Canadian, Amos Peck Seaman. He was born in New Brunswick and raised in Nova Scotia. He and his brother Job lived up to their last name by building their own ships and running trade from Nova Scotia to New England and the Caribbean. In his 30s, Amos collected rents for the wealthy Debar family. He eventually bought their 7,000-acre estate. That's 28 square kilometers. But the real profits were not from the tenants and squatters who farmed the land. The big money was in high-quality sandstone formations, which could be mined at low tide. The sandstone was turned into thousands of giant grindstones, earning Amos the nickname the Grindstone King. He developed a flour mill, a sawmill, and coal mine on the estate. He was also active in local government, built a school and 2 churches, and lobbied for a railroad to ship fish to nearby Canada. He dropped his middle name, Peck, saying that a peck, being only 8 quarts, was too small a measure for a man like himself. With a few more men like Amos, the Maritimes might still be the industrial and financial center of Canada. Unfortunately, he left a weirdly complicated will. It led to protracted lawsuits, which crippled his enterprises. Onslow Stearns was an early railroad man, starting with construction and later moving into management. He constructed the Lowell and Nashua in the 1830s, when a 17-mile railroad was still a big deal. And then came the Northern Railroad of New Hampshire, the Vermont Central Railway, and the Old Colony Railroad to Cape Cod. Stearns was also a Republican politician, starting in the New Hampshire State Senate when Lincoln was president, and serving as governor from 1869 to 71. Ezekiel Straw started as a civil engineer for the Amos Cotton and Woolen Manufacturing Company in Manchester, New Hampshire. After he went to Britain and learned the machinery for printing patterns on muslin, Manchester, New Hampshire grew to have the largest cotton mill in the world. At its peak in World War I, they had 30 mills, weaving a total of 50 miles of cloth per hour. After Manchester incorporated as a city in 1846, Ezekiel pretty much designed the whole place. He laid out new streets and lots, established a Unitarian congregation, helped build a dam, a canal, the waterworks, a gaslight company, a public library, a tool company, a fire insurance company, and the forerunner of the National Textile Association. Ezekiel was also a New Hampshire politician, serving 5 years in the state Congress and 2 years in the state Senate. Here's one of our big boys, Leland Stanford. He went by his unusual middle name, Leland, no doubt because his first name was Amasa. He was born and raised upper middle class beside the Erie Canal near Albany, New York. He became a lawyer and married well and settled in Port Washington, Wisconsin, with an excellent law library provided by his father. Well, in 1852, the law library and his other possessions were destroyed in a fire. Looking for a fresh start, Leland followed 4 of his brothers to the California gold rush. He opened a general store and then a wholesale house. He became rich not from the mines, but from the miners. He was enthralled by California, and he brought his wife west to settle permanently. In 1861, at age 39, he joined with Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker to form the Central Pacific Railroad. Leland was president. That was also the year he became governor of California, and they named their first locomotive the Governor Stanford. In 1869, they joined tracks with the Union Pacific Railroad at Promontory Point, and Stanford presided at the last spike ceremony, which opened the first transcontinental railroad, and he became president of Southern Pacific Railroad, too. In 1868, he and his cronies founded the Pacific Union Express, which soon merged with Wells Fargo to provide banking and stagecoach service. He started the Pacific Mutual Life Insurance Company, which is now the insurance and pension fund giant Pacific Life. In 1874, he got into steamships to Japan and China. He also owned the largest vineyard in the world. He became a U.S. Senator from California. And if you convert his $50 million net wealth to $20, he died a billionaire. Leland Stanford is, in fact, one of the famous robber barons, men who got rich through unscrupulous capitalism. I will not whitewash him. He lived in a time of cutthroat capitalism, and he played as hard and mean as the other railroad men. Here's a quote from philanthropyroundtable.org. Political maneuvering made Stanford a very rich man. He participated in the worst practices of the Gilded Age: stock watering, kickbacks, rebates, bribes, collusion, monopoly. There is no acquitting Stanford on this front. His participation in such schemes is amply recorded in his letters. One historian of the transcontinental railroads argues that the principals of the era made clear their unsavory activities in correspondence, in part, quote, because the dimmer lights among them, such as Leland Stanford, had to have so much explained to them, unquote. I'm afraid Leland also spoke against California's Chinese workers and fought hard against Chinese immigration. Late in life, Leland worked to prevent future robber barons from exploiting future workers. He supported the agenda of the People's Party, or populists, who wanted to stop depredations by the large banks and railroads. He supported the creation of worker-owned cooperatives. I guess, after all, he understood the need better than anyone. I'm sure you've heard of Stanford University, founded in 1885 by Leland and his wife Jane. It's not named for them. It's for their only child, Leland Jr., who sadly died of typhoid fever, age 15, while touring in Italy. The Stanfords responded by declaring, quote, "The children of California shall be our children," unquote. They put tens of millions of dollars into the university. The first graduating class included Herbert Hoover. And that's all I have on Stanford. I don't seem to have anything on his wife, Jane, who was poisoned in California, ran away to escape the poison, and the poison followed her and killed her off in Hawaii. That dramatic story, I guess, is going to be told another day.
John, why was he a Unitarian? Or how do you know that he was a Unitarian?
Let me see. Do I have that in here? Dun, 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 dun.
Or did he have a conversion later in life?
We have had some bad Unitarians in our time. For example, Leland Stanford. He's not the only one. I mean, by and large, we're a pretty nice bunch, but we've had our unscrupulous guys. You know, I don't have it written here. I don't know how we know he was a Unitarian. I'm not sure if he was raised that way or not.
Or maybe he was just a nominal Unitarian. The way you had to put down, you know, Baptist, Catholic, Unitarian, but maybe it didn't mean anything to him.
Maybe. I mean, I don't feel I have the right to kick the bad Unitarians out of my show. I mean, everyone works so hard, for example, to disown Hitler as a Christian, but the guy was a Christian, you know. It's just, he wasn't a good Christian. I'm not arguing that. He was a really terrible Christian, but there's no reason to think he wasn't one. Anyway, let's definitely not go down that road. Yeah, I'll have to try to find out when he became a Unitarian. I don't have his conversion or deconversion story included in here. And all the same, I will move on. Maybe at the end of the talk, maybe I'll try to Google online and come up with his Unitarian connection.
Okay.
Meanwhile, here's someone we're happy to claim, another Canadian. Emily Howard Stowe, née Jennings, was the first female doctor in Canada. Now, I personally dislike the fact that she prescribed homeopathic drugs. But to be fair, mainstream medical drugs in her time were also ineffective, not to mention actively dangerous. Emily was born, raised, and homeschooled as a prosperous Quaker in Upper Canada. At age 15, she took her first job as a school teacher. After graduating with first-class honors from the Normal School for Upper Canada in Toronto, she took a job in Brantford as Ontario's first female public school principal. But when her young husband, John Stowe, got tuberculosis, she was inspired to take up medicine. Canadian med schools didn't accept women, so she left 3 young children in her sister's care and attended the homeopathic New York Medical College for Women on the Hudson River. In 1867, she set up an unlicensed practice in Toronto, catering to women and children. I'm sure she was pleased in the mid-1870s when her husband John officially recovered from his tuberculosis. Now, in 1879, a woman for whom Emily had prescribed medicine died, and Emily was arrested for performing an abortion. She underwent a long trial, but many witnesses, including doctors, testified to her good character and her professional skill, and she was acquitted. Perhaps as a direct result, she was granted a medical license in 1880. Now, she hadn't sat the necessary exams, but they used a loophole. They counted her teenage work with a doctor friend of the family as the start of her medical career. The Ontario Medical Act of 1869 said that anyone who'd been practicing since 1850 could be admitted So Emily was in. In 1883, Emily founded the Women's Medical College, Toronto. Now associated with U of T and recently renovated at the north end of Hospital Row, it's an important part of Toronto's healthcare support. Emily also made a name as a suffragist and was famous enough to be its face in political cartoons. In 1883, she founded Canada's first suffrage group, the Toronto Women's Literary Club. In 1889, she founded the Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association. Emily became a member of the Toronto Unitarian Church in 1879. When she left in 1891, it was because she was more UU than the Unitarians were. She helped found a Canadian branch of the Theosophical Society. And late in life, she wrote that she had, quote, outgrown all religious creeds, standing in the broad field of inquiry, a truth seeker, unquote. Here is Charles Proteus Steinmetz. So suppose a hunchback dwarf shuffles towards you, dragging one leg, and says in a Middle European accent, would you like to see my lightning machine? Surely that must be Igor. Or if you're a Frankenstein purist, surely it must be Fritz, the actual name of Frankenstein's lab assistants in the 1931 movie. But no, it's not Igor or Fritz. It's real-life German-American scientist Charles P. Steinmetz, the man who is front and center in this photo. He was quite famous, so Frankenstein's casting director may have had him in mind. But he's not horror movie stuff. The guy on the left actually looks more sinister, don't you think? That's Albert Einstein. Charles was born in Germany 5 days before Abraham Lincoln's assassination, a hunchback dwarf with hip dysplasia. His mom named him Karl August Rudolf Steinmetz. He changed his own middle name to Proteus. Despite a checkered and storied career, that may be the most amazing thing about him. He was working on a doctorate in Breslau in 1888 when he came under investigation by Bismarck's police for socialist activities. If you don't know Bismarck, just pretend it's the Gestapo. He fled to Switzerland, and when his Swiss tourist visa expired, he went to America at age 24. He got in on the ground floor for the electrification of America, working at first on electrical transformers for Rudolf Eichenmeyer. He ended up at General Electric after Edison bought Eichenmeyer's company in 1893. His greatest contributions were in alternating current. Here's a quote from Wikipedia. Use of Steinmetz's innovations in the mathematics of electricity enabled engineers to move from designing electric motors by trial and error to designing them with the aid of applicable mathematics to create on paper the best possible motor before actually constructing it, unquote. If you have enough background and you want to learn more, you can see the links in his Wikipedia article to magnetic hysteresis and phasor. And for the rest of us, there's also a link to electrical. Charles was called the forger of thunderbolts. He was the first to create artificial lightning using a football field-sized laboratory at GE with 120,000 volt generators. Charles chose not to marry and have children because his spinal deformity was hereditary. It did not keep him from an active life. He had a huge house in Schenectady with a built-in research lab and greenhouse. He also owned a camp on the Mohawk River. In 1894, he started America's first hang glider club. And he had colorful pets, owls, alligators, a raccoon, and a Gila monster. When his lab assistant, Joseph Leroy Hayden, got engaged, Charles proposed an unusual arrangement. Come live with me. They had to talk the bride into it, but she came around. He legally adopted Hayden, and when Hayden had 3 children, Charles acted as a devoted grandfather, always playing with the children. Charles was an agnostic. His Unitarian connection is that the Haydens were Unitarian, and Charles attended All Souls Unitarian in Schenectady whenever there was a children's program. Here is yet another giant whom I can't cover in the depth that he deserves. Albert Schweitzer was doctor, scientist, theologian, organist, and Bach scholar, humanitarian, and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He became a Unitarian late in life and was an honorary member of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. Albert was born in Alsace on the French-German border. His mother tongue was Alsatian. He considered himself French, but wrote mostly in German. He was a Lutheran pastor's son. His village had Catholic and Protestant congregations sharing the same building, a compromise they reached after the 30 Years' War, that would be in 1648, which had stood for over 200 years. Albert took their ecumenical spirit to heart. Albert decided early in life to devote his first 30 years to himself and the rest of his life to humanity. But his first 30 years weren't what you'd call hedonistic. His talent for organ music impressed French master Charles-Marie Widor, who tutored him free of charge and helped him found the Paris Bach Society. Young Albert studied Protestant theology at Strasbourg, Paris, and Tübingen, earning a PhD on the religious philosophy of Kant. In 1906, he published The Quest of the Historical Jesus, gaining an international reputation among religious liberals. He followed this in 1931 with The Mysticism of the Apostle Paul. True to his life plan, and over the protests of friends and family, he resigned his job as deacon and curate in 1905 and spent 7 years earning a medical degree. The thesis for his medical degree was not a paper on kidneys or tonsils, but the psychiatric study of Jesus. His passion for medicine was inspired by a call from the Society of Evangelical Missions of Paris for medical doctors in Africa. He clung to that vision even after the society rejected him as theologically unsound. In 1912, he married Hélène Breslau, a Jewish social worker. Now, with a wife and a medical diploma, he returned to the Society of Evangelical Missions. He would not submit to an inquiry into his beliefs, but he met each of the committee members individually and was finally accepted. He and Hélène took the 14-day raft journey north on the Ogooué River to Lambaréné in French West Africa, now Gabon, and established the Albert Schweitzer Hospital. The first hospital was a chicken hut, but they expanded to 2 rooms of corrugated iron with a log waiting room and a log dormitory. They were soon swamped with patients. After 2 years, World War I broke out. As Germans in a French colony, Albert and Hélène were interned, but allowed to continue their work. In 1918, he was returned to France for a combination of health and security reasons. Ironically, after the Treaty of Versailles, his nationality became French, because, of course, the territory switched back to being part of France. He spent the next 6 years raising money to go back to Africa. He also furthered his academic work, producing The Decay and Restoration of Civilization and Civilization and Ethics. When Albert returned to the hospital in 1924, it had to be rebuilt, but he soon had assistant staff, some European and some African. He worked at the hospital off and on for the rest of his life, including throughout World War II. At age 90, he died at the hospital. He and his wife are both buried there. Today, the original hospital is a museum and a UNESCO site. Since 1981, there's been a new hospital with road access, 150 beds, and one of Africa's best research labs with a focus on AIDS and tuberculosis. I can't claim that everything is rosy. I found a 2016 news article saying that they have a funding crisis, but the hospital struggles on. Albert built and ran his hospital partly to atone for the sins of colonization and partly as an expression of his central philosophy, reverence for life. His reverence went beyond the Christian ideal and beyond modern environmentalism. He embraced the Jain principle of reverence for all life. Adlai Stevenson once visited the hospital, and at one point he slapped a mosquito on Schweitzer's neck. Schweitzer said, "That's my mosquito." Besides, there was no need to call out the Sixth Fleet.
Mm-hmm.
Albert himself considered this message, reverence for life, to be his greatest contribution to mankind. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. By now, I've studied over 800 lives in this UU project, and I believe Albert Schweitzer tops them all. He did everything, always with excellence, with the highest principles, and with high effectiveness. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, or Villy, was an Arctic explorer and a champion of First Nations rights. He grew up mostly in the United States, and the U.S. Post Office put him on a stamp. But he was born a Unitarian Icelandic Canadian. If you don't trust me, trust Pierre Burton and the National Film Board. In most of his photos, he looks like the strong silent type, but actually he was a witty and articulate man and a prolific author. His interest in Unitarianism brought him to Harvard Divinity School, although he explained to them that he was there as an anthropologist. After he spent 2 summers in Iceland studying the effects of diet on tooth decay, Harvard recommended him as anthropologist to the Anglo-American Polar Expedition of 1906. Billy made it to the Arctic that year, but the expedition did not. He used the time to train with the Inuit for living off the land. Billy loved the Arctic and learned to travel in it as easily as we go from Toronto to Montreal. He called it the Polar Mediterranean, the place where cultures from North America, Europe, and Asia came together. He was frustrated by Southern myths about the North and the seeming inability of other explorers to learn Northern ways. He usually made his explorations on foot, pulling a sled. For the next 40 years, he split his time between the Arctic and Greenwich Village, New York, staying north for up to 5 years at a stretch. He had a common-law northern wife, Fanny Panigabluk, or Pan. He did not formally acknowledge their son, but he did give him financial support. Here's some quotes. "Adventure is a sign of incompetence. There are 2 kinds of Arctic problems, the imaginary and the real. Of the 2, the imaginary are the most real." Vilhjalmur's frustration with myths about the Arctic was probably his inspiration for 2 philosophy books on the nature of truth, The Standardization of Error and Adventures in Error. They cover factoids like Santa Claus, ostriches burying their heads in the sand, and tales of exploration and discovery. Quote, "What is the difference between unethical and ethical advertising?" Answer, "Unethical advertising uses falsehoods to deceive the public. Ethical advertising uses truth to deceive the public." He also wrote a book recommending a high-fat diet. At a dinner party in his honor, he asked for a pound of butter because, he said, there was no blubber and the wax candles were too hard. George Sarton was born and raised in Belgium, where he won an award in chemistry and a PhD in mathematics. He and his wife went to the U.S. as refugees from World War I. He joined the faculty at Harvard and stayed for life. George is considered the founder of the discipline History of Science. And to sort of prove it, he co-founded the History of Science Society and its two magazines, Isis and Osiris. He eventually wrote 3 large volumes, 2 with a part 1, part 2, for a total of 5 books. He was inspired to study science's history by the life of Leonardo da Vinci, but da Vinci is not in his books. It is somewhere between impressive and ironic that after 21 years and 4,300 pages, George only got through the 14th century, when some would say science hadn't yet really found its legs. He learned Arabic and traveled the Middle East to read the Islamic scientists. Since science continued to happen after the 14th century, the History of Science Society is still operating. Every year they award the George Sarton Medal for an outstanding contribution to the field. If Dirk Jan Struik looks old in this photo, it's because he lived to 106. He said, quote, "I've lived this long because I didn't die," unquote. He also said, "Mathematicians grow very old. It is a healthy profession. The reason you live so long is that you have pleasant thoughts," unquote. Dirk was born in Holland and educated in Europe. He came to MIT in 1926, where he was an excellent teacher. In addition to math itself, he wrote on the history of mathematics. I find it interesting that Sarton and Struik could be pioneers in studying the history of intellectual life as late as the 20th century. It now seems, to me at least, a very natural field of study. Dirk also pioneered the history of science and engineering as they developed in his adopted New England. He did this in the 1940s and used Marx's dialectical materialism as his framework. He had been a communist since his student days. So he obviously got into trouble in the McCarthy era, a time he described as, quote, half reminiscent of Nazi Germany, half of Alice in Wonderland, unquote. When he appeared before HUAC in 1951, that's the House Un-American Activities Committee, he took the fifth. He was indicted, but friends posted the $1,000 bail required to keep him out of jail. MIT suspended him for 5 years, but with pay, so it was more of a sabbatical. After retiring at age 65, he worked to promote the history of science in Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, and Central America. William Elgin Swinton was born in Scotland and lived in Britain for 61 years, although he took some exciting trips. An exhibition to Spitsbergen at age 20, and an unsuccessful attempt to climb Everest in his late 50s. He worked for many years in the geology department of the British Museum, Natural History, mostly on fossils. William was a bit of a celebrity, often appearing on the BBC program Animal, Vegetable, or Mineral. In 1934, he wrote a book called The Dinosaurs, but I'm sorry to say that many paleontologists wish that he hadn't. It was already out of date when he wrote it, and being very popular, it remained in print in many languages for several decades. He wrote other popular fossil books in the 50s and 60s, hopefully better ones. At age 61, he emigrated to Canada to become a professor of zoology at U of T and director of biology at the Royal Ontario Museum and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Within 2 years, he was overall director of the ROM and made a great success of it. The ROM increased in both attendance and scientific reputation. Lyman Spitzer, at age 24, completed his doctorate at Princeton University and joined the faculty. He worked on sonar during World War II and from 1951 to 61 on Project Matterhorn, now called the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. They studied atomic fusion for both military and peaceful purposes. Lyman gave the project its original name. He was an avid mountaineer. He and his friend Donald Morton were the first to climb Mount Thor on Baffin Island. But I deliberately buried the lead story. Lyman was mostly an astronomer, studying the dust and gas in deep space between the stars and making important contributions to stellar dynamics and plasma physics. In 1947, he became the chairman of Princeton's Astrophysical Sciences and director of Princeton Observatory. From 1960 to 62, he was president of the American Astronomical Society. In 1946, when rocketry was in its infancy, Lyman wrote a paper to the RAND Corporation proposing space telescopes. He worked toward that goal for decades. In 1962, he headed a team to work on a space telescope to observe ultraviolet light, which you cannot see from Earth, not in the wavelengths they were looking for. This became the Copernicus telescope, launched 1972 and operating until 1981. He is the father of the Hubble Space Telescope. In 1965, he became head of a committee to define objectives for a large space telescope. In 1975, work began, a joint effort by NASA and the European Space Agency. Congress approved the budget in 1977. Spitzer participated in 13 years of development and remained deeply involved during its operation in the 1990s. I'd just like to mention, I only found out a couple of years ago that I'd always assumed that beautiful pictures like this one, the top, it's called the Pillars of Creation. I'd always assumed that we couldn't see them with the naked eye because they were so small, being far away. That turns out not to be the case. We can't see them because they are so faint. Many of these pictures that you see like this are bigger than the moon in terms of how big they would be in the sky. They're all up there. They're just invisible until you can get the right way to look at them. So Spitzer's legacy is the Hubble, but his memorial is the Spitzer Space Telescope, a name selected in the 2003 contest open to the public. It is the fourth of NASA's Great Observatories program. The Hubble for visible and near ultraviolet light, the Compton for gamma rays and hard X-rays, the Chandra for soft X-rays, and the Spitzer for the infrared spectrum. All except Chandra are still operational today. Many of Spitzer's instruments stopped working in 2009 when the liquid helium used to keep them cold finally ran out. But remaining instruments continue to send data from its heliocentric orbit, which by now is a few 100 million kilometers from Earth. It's currently hunting for exoplanets and identifying interesting targets for further study by its planned successor, the James Webb Telescope. Another interesting guy, Richard Schultes. From Africa to the Arctic Circle to the depths of space, we now travel to the Amazon jungle. Why is this man smiling? Well, Richard Schultes was the father of modern ethnobiology. That means his job was to travel to all those dots on the map and try out their hallucinogenic drugs. I am not trying to belittle Richard's work. Being environmentally minded, you have probably heard the argument that the rainforest should be preserved, among other reasons, because their biodiversity may yield important medicinal drugs in future. This and similar arguments start from and are supported by Richard's work. To give a more balanced view of his life, Richard was the son of a Boston plumber who went to Harvard on a full scholarship. He planned to be a doctor, but he took a course with orchid expert Oakes Ames, another Unitarian, and got hooked on botany, becoming an assistant in the Botanical Museum. He specialized early in psychoactive drugs, studying peyote in Oklahoma, mushrooms and morning glory in Oaxaca, Mexico, and curare, Thanks to Richard, curare is now in common use as a muscle relaxant during surgery. I certainly had not known that. Richard first went to the Amazon during World War II in search of disease-resistant rubber trees. But even on that first trip, he concurrently did ethnobotany under a Guggenheim Foundation fellowship. In the jungle, he experienced hunger, beriberi, malaria, and near drowning. Like Stefansson in the Arctic, he respected the natives, saying, "The ethnobotanical researcher must realize that far from being a superior individual, he, the civilized man, is in many respects far inferior." In his career, he collected over 30,000 specimens and identified 300 new species of plants. Wikipedia is full of anecdotes I have to share. He was a very popular professor and inspired many students to become botanists. On one hand, he had a formal demeanor, wearing a white lab coat and requiring students to learn the correct Latin names. On the other hand, he showed films of drug use, gave blowgun demonstrations, and had students extract finished products from plants in the lab. He did not support the American Revolution and voted for Queen Elizabeth in presidential elections. Yes, well, born in 1915, what can I tell you? Richard's work helped inspire Aldous Huxley, William Burroughs, Carlos Castaneda, and fellow Harvard professor Timothy Leary to experiment with drugs as a pathway to enlightenment. But Richard was not really supportive or impressed. When Burroughs described his use of ayahuasca as a great metaphysical experience, Richard said, "Oh, that's funny, Bill. All I saw was colors." Herbert A. Simon. As an insight into Herbert Alexander Simon's personality, here are two portraits by Richard Rappaport. Rappaport painted the one on the left first. Herbert commissioned him to paint the one on the right, saying the first portrait was too flattering. Well, here is his photograph. He was among the most influential economists, political scientists, and social scientists of the 20th century. At age 31, he published his groundbreaking Administrative Behavior, a study of decision-making processes in administrative organization. It coined the terms bounded rationality and satisficing, the idea being that, yes, humans in business do make rational decisions, but only as time and circumstances allow. Once they find a sufficiently satisfactory answer, they have satisficed, and they move on to the next problem. In this comic at the bottom right, internet cartoonist Randall Munroe admits that he gets into trouble when he breaks that rule. Herbert took a postgraduate physics course just to understand how hard sciences use math, wanting to do the same for sociology. So administrative behavior does use math, but it acknowledges that decisions are made by imperfect people with imperfect information and sometimes conflicted loyalties, and it includes the decision process itself as a cost. He won the 1978 Nobel Prize for Economics. Herbert was also a pioneer in artificial intelligence, working with Alan Newell in the 1950s to create the first AI programs, the logic theory machine and the general problem solver. Their work won the Turing Award in 1975. In all, Herbert authored 27 books and over 1,000 papers. As of 2016, on Google Scholar, he was the person most cited for artificial intelligence and cognitive psychology. Here's our last guy today, Charles E. Scripps. I hope this man was a Unitarian. I don't find it mentioned in his internet biographies, but he's on several UU lists, including on a t-shirt that I own. I guess that's pretty authoritative. The biographies just say that he was a major supporter of the Salvation Army. For 4 decades, Charles E. Scripps was the chairman of the board for his grandfather's media empire, E.W. Scripps Company. Edward Willis Scripps started by founding the penny press in 1878, and those pennies really added up. Penny press became the Cleveland Press. Edward added 24 more newspapers and formed the UPI News Service. One thing led to another, and the Scripps family fortune was recently ranked as the 40th largest fortune in the U.S. Charles gets a lot of credit for that. He took the company public to raise capital, although the family still has controlling interest and runs the board. At the last count, they owned 6 AM stations, 28 FM stations, and 32 television stations. Under Charles's leadership, Scripps created HGTV, the Food Network, the DIY, Do-It-Yourself Network, and the Travel Channel. When asked about his guiding principle, Charles said, quote, "It's simple, really. Just look at the direction you're going and ask, can we be proud of that?" Unquote. Since 1986, the Scripps Howard Foundation has an annual award in his name to honor media outlets that promote literacy. Ohio University gave him an honorary doctorate to recognize his, quote, championship of press freedom worldwide, unquote. And that's it for today.